it wasn't that long ago, it was a dream to be able to get high quality genome sequence by any method for any amount of money. And now it's something that's affordable to regular people to do not just one embryo, but all of the embryos.
Welcome to the podcast. We have George Church today. He's a professor of genetics at Harvard who needs no introduction. He's one of the very few academics who's making sci-fi real for all of us. So yeah, we're going to have a pretty wide-ranging conversation today, but welcome to the podcast. Awesome to have you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So I wanted to start by just talking about you've either been a co-founder or advisor or investor to so many different companies. What do you think are some of the obvious things that put companies on the right path? And what are some of the things that maybe some patterns you've seen? And hey, these are failure modes where if you're trying to translate something from the academic or the research world to the real world, these are some mishaps of things that go wrong.
Yeah, so I've been co-founder on about 48 companies and advisor to a similar number. And I think one of the main things that can go wrong is if the CEO is a mismatch with the technology or the team. For example, one of my CEOs had never had a company less than 600 employees, and
Mhm.
so had the mindset of having a big sales force and was selling things before they were really cost effective to be sold. And so the irony is the better the sales force, the faster you run out of your capital. And of course, you have a lot of very happy customers because you underpriced, but that's one way. Another way is even earlier than that, when an academic is thinking about, often has an inflated view of the potential of their baby project, or they had trouble getting a grant and they say, well, this is an alternative to getting a grant. When in fact, really, anything that's too speculative for a grant is probably way too speculative for a startup. Another aspect of this, though, is what is failure? To a venture capitalist, they expect 75% of them to fail in the sense of not returning on the investment or is breaking even or worse. But that isn't necessarily a failure in a global sense or in an academic sense, where you just want the idea to take root in the world.
We already got to the very nature of success itself. Okay, cool. What about the ones that either were commercial successes or in your mind, basically a philosophical success of, hey, this was a idea that took better root in the world? Is there any similarities, or what would you say you gleaned from the ones that you think
Yeah,
weren't?
some of them are just, I think the best ones are really unpredictable. And it depends on where in the success pipeline you're talking about, because some people don't consider it a success until a million people are happy customers. Other people consider it a success when they get a liquidity event at the earliest moment. But anyway, some of them are surprising to me. For example, Eric Kelsick I was on his student committee, and then he was a postdoc in my lab, and he was a regular talented scientist, but he became CEO of Dino Therapeutics. And within just a few months of starting, he had $4 billion of commitments from big pharma. And it's just, as far as I know, he didn't go to business school. Another one was the elephant project, our endangered species and extinct species company called Colossal. But before it was Colossal, a stranger basically walked into my office and just was curious what we were doing, Ben Lamb, and he locked into this mammoth idea. And he says, oh, I'm going to go out and raise you $3 million. I said, well, that'd be a whole lot more than we got now. And he went out and got $250 million instead of 3 million. Another example is the 4 CRISPR companies, all within a few blocks of each other. I was involved in 3 of the 4. And people were worrying that, oh, aren't they going to sue each other? And aren't 3 of them go belly up? And I said, no, probably there's not nearly, 4 is not nearly enough. So I think a lot of success is predicted by the vision and persistence of the founder, especially the founder that joins the company.
What do you think makes you personally different than other academics? Why do you think you're more of an anomaly? in terms of being so prolific on the commercial, obviously academic front as well, but commercial front being more unique?
I think some academics stay away from it, not because they think it's like playing the lottery. They think that it's unlikely that anything will come of it and it will consume a lot of time. And I think that's a fair critique. A fairly large number of them felt that it was somehow tainting their research in one way or another. And there's still some. Other reasons are that a lot of them would like to, but their licensing patenting office tells them that it's not patentable, or the patent office tells them that it's not patentable if they get it past their own office. And in principle, you can start a company without any IP, without any patents, but in practice, it's enough to discourage either the inventor or the investors.
So those are
Oh,
some reasons not to. So I guess why, despite
oh yeah. So
giving all of those objections some credibility, why do you still do
right.
it?
So what happened to me? It dropped on my head as a kid or something. I
Yeah, exactly.
I think part of it was I was fairly addicted to technology development, which is again a rarity among academic biologists, I think. Maybe it's
Yeah.
increasing lately, but it's rare to have that as an entire focus. You might get lucky and somebody says, "Hey, that's a drug." And then you go to your technology office and they get it patented and licensed. But mine was very intentional. And not only that, but I was addicted to technologies that looked nearly impossible or useless. So that they would be particularly off-putting for people. So that was just a predisposition. It had nothing to do with money.
Cool. I guess switching gears a little bit, obviously, we're super honored to have you as an investor at Orchid. What excites you about whole genome sequencing of embryos?
Well, first of all, it's a technological miracle. You're taking 3 cells out of 120 in an embryo and getting very high quality whole genome sequence out of it. It wasn't that long ago. It was a dream to be able to get high quality genome sequence by any method for any amount of money. Let's
Mhm.
say $3 billion to pick a random number. And now it's something that's affordable to regular people to do not just one embryo, but all of the embryos. So that's one thing. So that's the technological awe
That
that I,
must be so exciting for you because you were part of that very first,
oh yeah, I was,
and now seeing it go all the way to like just a few cells must be, I don't know, maybe you thought that it was going to happen back then, but that's like such an
yeah,
incredible arc, historical arc, just have seen it through.
yeah, no, it's really very gratifying. And if anything, it encourages me to be even more risk-taking in the future, but in terms of the technology, obviously not in terms of human life. But yeah, it's a affirmation that technology development can have impact on patients. And on the humane side, I know a fair number of people that were born by the IVF process, and some of them, the average number of cycles it takes to get a baby is, I think, on the order of 5, and one of my friends was 6, and that requires quite a bit of persistence. It's not an easy thing, especially for the mother, to have the hormone treatments at all, and much less the failures. So anything we can do to improve that by saying, "Oh, implanting this embryo will delay the arrival of because it's not likely to work." That's a kind of a humane component to it. Then there's the prospects for the future. All of these technologies I've been involved in have plummeted in price. I mean, sequencing been 20 million fold reduction, and I think that will almost certainly include all the things having to do with reproductive technologies, to the point where really this could be equitably distributed throughout the world. And there's trillions of dollars are at stake, and not to mention all kinds of pain and suffering, not just of the individual, but to the whole family. So that would be incredible. And as genetics goes, these very severe diseases, and with whole genome sequence, you can even get into slightly less severe, but they're very predictable, the most severe ones.
Yeah, this is the thing that I found really interesting is that there's these neurodevelopmental disorders panel, there's baby there's a lot of sequencing that's happening of infants in the pediatric setting and in the adult setting, all for monogenic causes of disease. And I'm just curious, why do you think that's not further adopted? Why do you think that is?
I think it has to do with people being unconcerned about 1% risk in general. That is to
Hmm.
say, smoking, wearing your seat belts, taking vaccines. These are all things where you have roughly a 1% or less chance of dying. And you feel like 99% chance of success. That's really great odds at Las Vegas. Why isn't it great odds for these other three things? And it's a strange relationship we have to public health. The things that are obvious to people who work at the School of Public Health, like I do occasionally, it's obvious that we should be implementing these things, preventative medicine and so forth. But another thing that's not fully appreciated, I think, even by some of the specialists, is that the risk of a false positive, usually in medicine, any kind of false positive is just stay away from that. For example, if you're, let's say, 30 something year old woman who gets a diagnosis of BRCA1 or 2, that probably means you're talking about bilateral mastectomy and ovarectomy and the possibility of not having any kids. A false positive there is horrible medicine. It's very, and fortunately it's rare. But But if you put that into an IVF clinic or into a premarital preconception, all of those have a much lower impact of a false positive because you're focusing on the positives and you're not ablating any body part unnecessarily.
That's a really good point, specifically in the IVF setting, because you have multiple embryos. Currently, you're choosing by something like embryo grade, which we've already documented that there's and intra-operator variability. Different embryologists give embryos different grades in different settings. Versus for the genetics, yes, there's obviously the chance of false positive with genetics. You have Sanger sequencing and other nice orthogonal methods to try to reduce that as much as possible. But yeah, at the end of the day, you have multiple embryos and you're prioritizing rather than what the unfortunate situation is with ongoing pregnancies with NIPT is that, okay, if you get a positive result, you only have one mitigation option, which is termination, which is much
Right.
worse than
Exactly.
being identify an embryo that hopefully is free of an anomaly and then have a healthy
Yep.
baby in a healthy
Yep.
pregnancy. So that's it. It's a really nuanced point.
There are all these contributors, and a lot of it has to do with inertia, that concern that something sounds too good. It's amazing
Mhm.
how often that prevents technology adoption is, oh, it can't be real. It has to
Mhm.
be hype and smoke and mirrors if it sounds too good. So there's all these reasons that there's reimbursement reasons, even though I think there's a tenfold return on investment for genetic counseling related things in general. The insurance companies won't do it until they see it proven at their level, which means that one of them has to break ranks and try it out and
Yeah.
completely try it out. You can't just do actuarial tables and prove it on paper. And so anyway, there are all these things that cause resistance, but I think we're getting close to the year that we will point to and say, that was the year that it went viral.
No, totally. I think that's, yeah, a really good point. Well, one thing that I think is exciting about genetic testing of embryos is that I think people sometimes care about their kids more than they care about themselves. So I think that maybe that the orientation is, oh, I don't want to find out maybe negative information about me, about my predispositions, but if I can prevent my child from having something that runs in my
Yeah.
family or that has affected another sibling, that maybe that will be more of a motivation for folks.
I think you hit the nail on the head, and that would be my prediction is that I've been looking for what is the tipping point. What is the going to be the thing? For a while, I thought it was Angelina Jolie appearing on the cover of Time saying, just volunteering her personal story about breast cancer prediction. That didn't move the needle a bit. I think this business about caring about your kids, once you see that it working in IVF, then people will start saying, okay, we can do it on the adult members of our family as well. But
Yeah,
who knows? There will be a tipping point. I just don't know what.
Yeah, that's the thing that,
Don't
you know,
yet know what it will be.
yeah, because in our consenting process, you get the whole genome of the embryos, and then you could have incidental findings about the parents, right? The parents don't necessarily need to have been sequenced, and you
Right.
can find out actually the parent status through the embryos, which is,
And there's
you know,
often something that the parents can do about it. There's
yeah.
at least for 70 adult onset genes, there's a lot that you can do about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so basically there's been around 5 million IVF babies born. When it was initially introduced, there was wide skepticism and this fear of, you know, why are we playing God? Similarly, when birth control was introduced, there was huge protests. So like the reproductive field specifically is usually under attack. So when it comes to embryo screening specifically, do you feel like you draw a distinction between reporting to parents the monogenic variants versus the polygenic side?
I think the main opinion is it should be up to the parents, but that requires that the parents are up to speed. And so I think in an ideal world, they would be quite comfortable with the science and would have an unambiguous opinion and a general agreement in the family. But anyway, if they're comfortable with it as a family, then there's no limit. I know everything about the genomes of everybody in my family. And studies have been done that people don't tend to overreact to this genomic information, but it still is a good idea to make sure they have truly informed consent.
No, I really agree. I think that some people want the maximum amount of information and some people just want a little bit. And I think that it feels very paternalistic when there's this outside party that's saying this is, in my opinion, this is the amount of information that you should or shouldn't have about your own embryos, your own kids are going to go into your own body. But yeah, I think that there's on the monogenic side, it's black and white versus on the polygenic side where you're predicting a propensity for an adult onset. Sometimes there's a distinction in how people feel about it. Is there like a big distinction in your mind?
I think some people would be justified in not staying away from things that are not actionable at all. And
Hmm.
another set would be justified in staying away from things that are below a certain threshold. There's no magic number where you say, oh, 75% predictability is threshold. And I think it will vary from person to person. But in general, if you're just prioritizing, then you should
Hmm.
take the one that satisfies medical criteria for the best one. And like I said before, it's the cost, the risk of false positives is not significant in some of these procedures that are done early in the conception process.
Yeah, that is I would say like a very unique but not often noted feature of it. So I guess zooming out to, okay, let's say we're super lucky to get lots of adoption and this became the default way people had kids. What do you think the world would look like? Do you think that would be a crazy outcome? Do you think it should be limited to people who are infertile, they're already going through IVF? It's a prioritization for them, or there's everyone else who's having kids. There's unfortunately, what is it like? I think something like 30 million Americans that have a rare disease. Hopefully, in the future, gene therapies will become much cheaper and personalized for all those very specific anomalies they have. But yeah, this is something that's been talked about in sci-fi for a long time. This idea of divorcing sex from reproduction. What if the default or the majority of people ended up having kids through IVF and through identifying the embryo that was free of whatever anomaly that they were concerned about?
It probably will be more widespread, and that might be a good thing. For example, miscarriages are extremely psychologically problematic for many families. If you could reduce the number of miscarriages, that would be great. Again, like getting your genome analyzed, you don't know whether you're at risk until you look. So even though the risk may be low, so it might be that you don't know whether you're at risk for a miscarriage, so that it could be, say, late in the process. So that's one consideration. The gene therapy angle, as much as I have contributed to and am proud of gene therapy, I am not seeing the prices come down quickly. In fact, I see them creeping up from $1.5 million to $2 million to $3.5 million is the most recent gene therapy. And for good reasons. There's a kind of a high fixed cost of research and development and clinical trials and a low denominator, which is the number of people that benefit from each of those clinical trials. Um, while IVF is essentially already approved and is just going to get better and better, more and more cost effective. So I actually see this it's shifting from emphasis on gene therapy. Gene therapy is very important if you're already born, but it's the medical public health
Constant.
and medical profession shifting over towards earlier stages where genetic counseling can save millions of dollars and a certain risk, a very definite risk of something that isn't covered by the $1 million gene therapies. Yeah, so I think the trend is going to be towards everybody getting IVF as the main way of having babies. I think that's a plausible future.
Yeah, I think it's super exciting. Obviously, pharma has created so many medical miracles for managing so many different types of chronic diseases, but it's just really cool the idea that at the time of transfer, the time of pregnancy begins, so many risks can be mitigated all at once. It's just something, obviously, I'm super excited about it. Anyone who's had a family member or themselves have their life hijacked by one of these typos, and then unfortunately, just like you're saying, the fixed costs and the N is usually really small for each of these rare diseases individually. So it's really hard for there to be an economic incentive for a company to go in and design a much less secure even medication that you can take for life to just treat the symptoms rather than addressing the root cause. Yeah, so that's a future I think is super exciting. I think the other thing that's really interesting about IVF is that there's already a population of people who aren't infertile that are doing it. There's women who are egg freezing who they have no documented infertility. They haven't even tried to get pregnant yet, but they're freezing their eggs. And people don't realize that egg freezing is exactly the same as IVF. It's the first part of it. You're freezing the eggs, and then
Right.
you can choose to fertilize them with your partner's sperm. But that procedure, people are already doing, I don't want to say recreationally, but essentially just to preserve optionality. So the idea of anyone who's trying to have kids, whether they want to do it to basically change their timeline or to mitigate disease, doing it doesn't seem like too far of a leap from where we're already at today. Another thing I wanted to switch gears to is just there's a fertility crisis happening right now. People aren't having enough kids. And I think people have a lot of concerns about, is this going to derail my career? When is the right time? Do you want to talk a little bit personally about how you and your wife made that decision? Like, how did your life change? Obviously, you guys have both had still super successful careers, but how did you guys decide this is the right time to have kids? This is how things are going to change or stay the same. Could you just walk us a little bit through your thinking there?
Yeah, I think anecdotes are not the way we do science, but they are the way we make personal connections and think things through. And in our case, we were both very interested in science and each other. We're not in a rush until we realized the biological clock was ticking and we were actually past the age where you would have to get an amniocentesis. Back then, that was the only game in town for prenatal. And we did. We decided after 11 years being together that we wanted to have a child and got in and found out that it was a healthy euploid girl. And so that meant we could name her Marie whilst she was still only 18 months and weeks old. And it was a good experience. It really made real we were both geneticists. It made real this whole idea that you can look at the chromosomes of your baby when there's barely even a bump on your belly. And it was just very, very moving personally. And then when she came out, was such an amazing person. You could relate little thing you could barely see in the ultrasound and chromosomes that were nicely arranged in the karyotype with a real person that has turned out well. And we now have grandchildren.
Wow, congratulations. That's amazing. So how did it change basically becoming a father? How did it change your relationship to your work?
So our child didn't sleep much. She wasn't cranky, but she just was wide awake, maybe sleep 5 hours a night. So we took turns with everything. And I think that overall, it doesn't really, it does consume time, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like you're gaining time. You're gaining perspective on the world. The hours that you're not at work are just as motivating as the hours that you are at work. And just keeps feeding forward. Now, obviously, if you have a very problematic birth, child, and so forth, you are going to be changing your profession from whatever it was to taking care of the child and raising money for studying the disease, so forth. As we've been talking about, that may be a thing of the past, or growing, because for every heroic parent that did that in the past, they solved the disease one way or another. They figured out what caused it. They figured out what could prevent it, so forth. And then the next set of parents won't deal with that. So I think that's inspiring to me. And the parents that gave up their job in order to advance the science and take care of their own child really benefited all of us. They didn't really quit their job. They did one of the most important jobs in the world. They became amateur geneticists, which really had just as much impact as some of the professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. It took decades of making sequencing cheaper and thousands and millions of people poring over all of this data to be able to curate these databases, so that it's standing on the shoulders of giants. It required so many different developments in different domains, so that we're at a state now where all of this literature has been compiled for the benefit of the next generation. So that's super exciting. So yeah, I guess I just want to close with kind of your other sci-fi ideas. Bringing back ancient species is obviously something that I think has captured everyone's imagination. We've obviously had a long track record of making things that sounded like science fiction turn real. Are there other things that are on your to-do list where like, I really want to make sure that this one gets a little bit further and stops being just a movie, but we get some animal models or we get some patients? Is there something like that's brewing for you that isn't quite there yet, but you think is going to be there in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, almost everything in our lab at some point
Mhm.
gets branded as impossible or useless or both.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, the thing about the elephant project is not just about extinct species, it's also about endangered species and about climate change. So it's three science fiction stories at once. But we
Hmm.
shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves. We haven't delivered on any of the three yet, although the main point is to deliver technology that could be applied to a number of agricultural species and even humans. And it's already having impact on adjacent things, like we're making some of the reproductive technologies we're developing are also useful in human. Some of the methods we have to develop for multiplex editing is having multiple advantages. For example, engineering elephants is not that different from engineering pigs, for which we get super safe and in some cases enhanced organs for transplant. What else?
Maybe just to focus on the reproductive technology side, what do you think is exciting there? Obviously, people have been talking a long time about in vitro gametogenesis, the idea of taking stem cells and converting them to egg or sperm cells. Where are we there? What are some of the things that your lab is doing? And do you think, maybe walk us through what the introduction into clinical care would look like for those
I,
projects?
I still think we're not there yet for gametogenesis. There's only one species that has in vitro gametogenesis, which is mouse. And even their gametes are extremely inefficient. It's maybe 2-3% success rate. But we live in exponential times. Almost every technology I've been involved in has gone exponential with doubling times close to a year. So I think that may be happening with gametogenesis as well. But it has to go through the same safety efficacy tests that every other medical treatment goes through. But we'll see. It's if we are making this major transition in society towards IVF, it would be nice to. This might be part of it, is being able to go from skin or blood is so far easier on the patient, on the mother, and then is the hormone treatments. But that could change. Both parts of that could change. So it's just symbolic of the progress that's happening. We also have developed granulosa cells that help the in vitro maturation process. For some people, that's a bigger deal than for others, maybe if you're older. And
I don't know if
then
you thought.
we're also developing artificial wombs, which I think is mainly aimed at veterinary and endangered species. But if you get enough experience with that and people notice how well it works for endangered species, they might say, okay, time to start carefully considering that for clinical use in certain extreme cases of high risk, say gestational diabetes or something like that, where you don't want to have a surrogate. Um, who knows where that goes? But again, that if that is safe and effective and widely accepted, like IVF, it could be a game changer for the gender biases that intrinsically come from sacrifices that are differentially made by the woman.
That's incredibly exciting. I just think that reproductive technology is this slice that I think has just incredibly high impact, right? Everyone has a mom, and one of the things that most people self-report as the most meaningful parts of their life is, having kids, and the actual process of it hasn't changed very much in 40 years. I'd say one of the biggest advances was the introduction of IVF. There's 5 million people right now who would never have existed if this this hadn't been invented. And I think that we're at this really interesting tipping point now where hopefully genetic testing will totally change and reshape and radically reduce the amount of disease the next generation has to face. But to your point, the burden of pregnancy on women, and a fraction of them are just not able to carry or have extremely complicated pregnancies. Like the fact that you guys are working on that is really exciting. And I hope that your successes will inspire more funding, more research, because it's such an important problem. And I just don't think there's enough people working on it, enough excitement around it that it deserves. But yeah, thanks so much for the time. It was a really wide ranging topic conversation, from startups to research to IVF. So it was amazing to get the chance to chat with you, and looking forward to seeing all these developments go from preprints out into the world and hopefully into the wild. Hopefully we get these endangered species back pretty soon.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and good luck on all of your contributions to clinical medicine.